Hi, this is Paul, and our friends over at Basecamp had, I thought, a really important video. This was a really good video. I'm just going to start with how Malcolm starts it.
As our society has become a more cush, easier to live in,
Yeah.
the expectations around comfort within life, around lack of challenges within life, have risen at a rate much faster than we have actually been able to meet them.
Yeah, I can't begin to emphasize how spot on this is because I love watching, for example, vintage cooking videos.
And so here I'm gonna move further with some actual data on this paradox because it's been studied in real world environments.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. I'm excited to be here with you today. Today, we are going to be talking about the Tocqueville paradox, which is really interesting and related to a lot of the concepts that we discuss on this show.
Interesting.
So, just as a summary, I'll start with a brief explanation of what it is, and we can go over some of the data on it, all right?
Okay.
The Tocqueville paradox describes a phenomenon where, as the overall quality of life and social conditions improve in a society, people's expectations rise at a faster rate, leading to increased discontent and frustration. In other words, as things get better, people tend to focus on what they don't have rather than appreciating the improvement they have experienced. This paradox suggests that there is a gap between the actual improvements in living conditions and people's perceptions of their lives. As societies become more prosperous and egalitarian, people's expectations for their personal lives and the overall quality of society increase. However, these expectations often rise faster than the actual rate of improvement, leading to a sense of relative deprivation and dissatisfaction, even though the absolute quality of life has improved.
So, basically, as things improve, our optimism and our ideals for how much further they can get outstrip the rate of improvement, and that leads to frustration. And this gets into first world problems. This gets into the spoiled girl who wants the goose that lays the golden eggs on Willy Wonka. This gets into how many different areas. I had never heard of this paradox before. And when I watched this video, it was like, oh, wow, this is a really big deal.
Now, for those
Further.
for those people listening to our podcast, like me, who have fuzzy memories of American history, do I have it right that Alexis de Tocqueville is the person who inspired this paradox and that he was the one who essentially first started talking about American status anxiety, writing about his experiences traveling through America as a man from France and seeing things like buildings with false facades that are really just normal squat buildings, but that have those old West town 2-story facades that look really fancy. And just that being indicative of many other examples and observations he made about Americans' obsession with showing and signaling material wealth. Is that the Alexis de Tocqueville we're talking about?
That's the one that we're talking about here. Yes.
Alrighty. Yeah, this is really interesting. I was just listening to another YouTuber's overview of Joseph Smith, the guy who started the LDS Church, talking about how at the turn of the American Revolution, around the time that Alexis de Tocqueville was traveling around the United States, only around 10% of Americans in this newly formed United States attended church regularly. So this was a largely godless society. And while I think a lot of the historical education that we got as kids was about the historical revivals and
Okay, now he's going to sort of adjust. Well, they weren't really godless, but her point is correct that American church attendance for American citizens reached its peak during the Cold War. And you wouldn't say that America was godless, they just didn't go to church. And there was certainly a lot of, let's say, assumptions about the world that were basically within the Judeo-Christian imagination. But this is going to get into practices and what, again, for those of you who missed a previous video where I talked about them a little bit, I thought the distributist essay, which you can either find on his Substack or here on YouTube, and I'll put the link below. I thought it gave some really strong critiques about basically similar to some of the critiques that I've had, that you can't really develop your own religion by sort of noticing things. And this gets into Vervaekian combinatorial explosiveness, because no matter how smart you are, you can't really sort of figure this whole thing out because you actually don't have enough life. And this is why sort of real things that develop over time, like religions, actually have way more in them than any of us would have lifetime to notice, much less detail out, much less sort of verbally highlight in order to reproduce. And that's why religious traditions very much grow organically, and they're also extraordinarily complex, and there are often little angles to them that nobody anticipated, and they're very living, dynamic things. Anyway, back to... Oh, I lost my mouse. Mouse.
About these creation, like the creation of the LDS Church, for example, these religious zealots and their advocacy and work. What was not being discussed was the largely godless society.
Well, it's because it was for two reasons. It was one, because these individuals wrote a lot more.
Yeah.
It's very similar to how if you're studying European history.
Well, and you also have to remember that, again, the Latter-day Saints, the Jehovah's Witnesses, many of these groups in the 19th century, we have these new religious movements. They don't make the religions up out of whole cloth. They're usually forking an existing religion, which in the burnt over district of upstate New York, it was called the burnt over district because the Great Awakenings had hit them so hard, it was basically, it couldn't find any more purchase there. But what's interesting is that it hit them so hard, certain new religious groups like the Latter-day Saints, the Jehovah's Witnesses, spring up and sort of go out from there and start colonizing other aspects. But again, the religions are so complex that almost any sort of new religious variant that forms doesn't just sort of form out of nothing. It has to take this tremendous tested body, tinker with some things, and go from there.
History, you're going to get a lot of history from the Roman perspective and very little from the Gallic perspective.
Right, and people are talking about the Dark Ages when really those ages weren't so dark. It was just, they weren't the word cell ages. They weren't the Substack ages. Yeah, and that was the problem. And so what I was thinking about, though, and just the thought I'll end with before you continue, is what I didn't realize about this period in American history is it is oddly similar to our period now, with largely non-religious people and also quite materialistic people. And that's why this paradox then and now are quite relevant, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I would say that the religiosity aspect, I think it's an interesting thing to bring up, but I don't know if it's directly relevant to this particular paradox. Because while religiosity does correlate with gratitude for what one has in life, I guess there's like a tangential connection, but I don't see it as a particularly large connection. However, I do think that the point that you just made is an incredibly important point to elevate, is that we have a misconception of rates of religiosity in certain historic time periods within America as being much higher. Now, we should note that these individuals believed in God. Like, the average person would have identified with some religious sect, and they would have believed in God.
And in that sense, there's some similarity, let's say, perhaps between a place like the Bible Belt, where there's a high degree of people who would sort of align with some Christian ideas. There'd be mixed in with a bunch of sort of folk Christianity, but obviously in the United States today, we have some other areas of the United States today where their term would be sort of the urban monoculture. That would be the religion, progressive liberationism, boomerality. We're still trying to sort of get a handle on how to define that religion. And again, it's sort of a variant of Christianity. I want to jump ahead here and get into the social media aspects.
In real world environments. So a 2006 study conducted in Pakistan directly tested Tocqueville's thesis using a survey experiment. The researchers manipulated participants' perceptions of their economic well-being and social mobility. As predicted by the theory, they found that political discontent often increased the most when declining personal well-being coincided with high perceived social mobility. So to explain a bit how this experiment worked, the key manipulation involved presenting different income brackets to each group when asking about their household income. The treatment group saw income brackets with higher ranges, making their own income seem relatively low. The control group was shown income brackets with lower ranges, making their own income seem more typical. For example, the middle income bracket for the control group was only 4,000 to 6,000 Rs, while the middle bracket for the treatment group was much higher. Findings. The results supported Tocqueville's theory. Political discontent was found to increase most significantly when individuals perceived a decline in their personal economic well-being. So basically, they were able to manipulate an individual's beliefs about how they were doing in society, and people would present both lower levels of personal. So keep in mind, the actual person's experience, like their physical experience day to day,
No different.
was the same, right? They had the same gadgets, they had the same property, they had the same education, they had the same spouse, and yet they would report more discontentment if they believed that there were other people that had more than them.
Because it's all relative. We're always looking at how we compare to other people.
And this led to political discontentment in their answers as well. Now, this creates a big problem when you are considering the way the online algorithm presents things to you, right? Because what you are getting served often is to like friendship what pornography is to sex.
Yeah, super stimuli. The super stimuli of affluence and hyperconsumption.
So the people that you see, whether it is on YouTube or Twitter or, well, really anywhere, TikTok, stuff like that, like any of these things where you're consuming content, these individuals are going to be dramatic.
Even, of course, and this has been true for a long time, television. People on television are portrayed, they're better looking, they're wealthier. By virtue of how stories work, whole ranges of things are sort of smoothed out. And again, we don't see all these things consciously, but we take them in and we absorb them.
Dramatically wealthier than the average individual. Not just because people click more on wealthy content, but the content that individuals get served the most is often the super influencers, because they just touch so many people, and these systems are not as built for the micro influencers.
Totally.
Where it's really hard to get out of that micro stance. But once you become the super influencer position, you're just making astronomical amounts of money from the platform itself, which means now you are showing off a lifestyle and making suggestions about a lifestyle that someone could lead that is completely unrealistic for the average American. And
also people like stuff that's aspirational. We don't want to see what we have already. We want to see something different, something novel, and that often is something unsustainably expensive.
Well, and this really messes with people in dating markets as well. So if you look at something like women, there's all these things where they're like, oh, what income do you want the guy you're dating to have? And the incomes that they throw out there are completely unrealistic. And there's been some great shows that have been like, what do you think the average person in America makes, right?
What would you want his income to be? I feel like this is gonna sound bad. I feel like 300,000.
I would have to say 127, probably 150 to a $250,000 a year.
$500,000. Is that bad?
150, maybe to 250,000 a year would be comfortable.
What kind of question is this?
I was just having this conversation with my friend, and she was like, you have to manifest a husband, girl. Ideally,
you manifest her. Got it.
My husband needs to be making like 650,000.
So you said you want 500K, but what do you think the median income is for a 30-year-old?
60K, 70K?
Yeah.
I think it's 250,000.
And right now, so the median salary, well, in 2022 in America was 37.5 thousand per year. And then if you go just a few years ago to 2012, it was 26.5 thousand.
Wow.
So most of that is actually inflation right now.
Yeah.
2012, 26.5 thousand is what the average the median American was making. And so when people are making these comparisons to the social media people, to et cetera, they think, and I've even noticed this among people like who I know, they think like the average American's making like around 50K per year. Even people who are trying to like lowball it. And I've seen estimates, sincere estimates that the average American is making like 80K per year, which is actually, and I'll
the funny thing though, when I now look at the amount of social services you get when you live at or near the poverty line, I feel like there's this really weird bump in society where someone making a certain, like making money around.
So anyway, you get the point that our perceptions have radically and falsely recalibrated. And her point is correct too. A friend of mine lives on $250 a month. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff around him that allows him to, I'm not talking about Freddie. Freddie can't live on $250 a month. That allows him to live at that level. And so these conversations are complex, but the point is it's the discrepancy between sort of the, how can I say this? We are groomed in our culture to acquire. And all of these ideals are up here, and we're just chasing up. And the higher we go, the further the delta is in terms of what we see. And I hear this and I see this in people's complaints. One of the things that people don't recognize about a lot of what a pastor hears is complaining. Complaining about a job, complaining about a spouse, complaining about health. People are full of complaints. And even just partly because of my job, taking prayer requests, a lot of prayer requests are complaining. Dennis Prager, who says, I never ask for things. He's the exception to the rule. The vast majority of people ask for things. And I'm not saying they shouldn't, but there's this dynamic. Now, to me, this gets into how could we recalibrate? Because a lot of this is, I think these two demonstrate quite clearly, a lot of this is thrown out of whack by these mediated relationships through the screens. On the live stream today, somebody came in and mentioned this interview. Now we'll see what the New York Times does after I play this, but
this isn't going to come as a news flash. Things feel fragile in America. And there is a broad consensus across parties and demographics that we are struggling to come together and face our many challenges. Which is why, when I heard about a new documentary about the Harvard...
Now again, even the fact that things feel fragile, that's in this dynamic too. Because everybody, especially in America, sort of assumes stability. Because things have been stable in America for many people for a long time. Now things feel fragile. So you have the same dynamic working in terms of people's calibrations about threat and future expectation.
Political scientist Robert Putnam, I knew I wanted to talk to him. Nearly 3 decades ago, Putnam became something pretty rare, a celebrity academic. In 1995, he published a groundbreaking paper called Bowling Alone: America's Declining Social Capital. In it, he used data from the previous few decades to prove that America was transforming from a nation of joiners to a nation of loners. We were going to church less, joining clubs at declining rates. And he warned that as a result, we were losing trust in our fellow Americans and our institutions. That paper caught the attention of then President Bill Clinton, and before long, regular people couldn't stop talking about it either. Putnam expanded it into a best-selling book a few years later. And for a moment, it seemed like his work might pull us back from this isolation highway we were all on.
Now, this is so fascinating when she said that. His work might pull us back. And it's like, how do you think people work? And, this is something I deal with church all the time because, quite rightly, people sort of look at church and say, well, church is supposed to go like this. The pastor says something and the people do it. And I try to tell people that is not how church works. Why? Because we're getting messages all the time and we don't do it. We don't work that way. And so, well, he wrote a book and he had Bowling Alone and we all talked about this. But again, I mentioned, Rod Hare mentioned on a live stream what he had heard me say, and I'm not sure whether or not I said it. But when I heard him say it, I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. The first dollar people have of money beyond subsistence usually goes to privacy. I just finished my rough draft for Sunday on Genesis 2 and 3, and right after the man and the woman eat from the tree, they hide, and they realize they're naked, and they sew fig leaves together. We, by virtue of, we hide. But then when we're hiding, we don't cover our eyes. We hide and we look out. And it's the distance that sort of makes this difference between our expectations and our realizations more strongly felt. And I think actually it is community that helps to recalibrate this. Because when you actually know and are known, love and are loved, these things begin to recalibrate. Because it's very interesting that for a while Jordan Peterson was making the point that the thinking about yourself is the definition of unhappiness. He made that point a number of times and places. I wonder if I can find it quick. Looks like somebody made a short from it. So here we go.
The more you think about yourself, the more unhappy you are. And it's such a striking phenomenon that if you look at this statistically, there's almost no difference between self-conscious thoughts, so thoughts that involve I, let's say, and suffering from the ravages of negative emotion like emotion and depression. And so this obsessive self-centeredness, narrow self-centeredness, just makes all of that suffering much, much worse. So clearly, that's clearly the case. And a victim is someone to whom things constantly happen involuntarily. And if you construe yourself as a victim rather than as an actor, let's say, then as an actor of your own destiny, then you put yourself in a situation where you're constantly under what your body responds to as stress.
Okay, I'll quit it there. Now, I think he's right. How does community counteract that? I think it counteracts it because community itself is hard. My men's Bible study, my in real life men's Bible study, which is actually on Zoom and it's just reserved for Living Stones people. It's not, you can't join it by this little corner or anything like that. But we're reading the book of Deuteronomy, and the early chapters of the book of Deuteronomy have all of this subtle psychological calibration. One of the things that the book of Deuteronomy says, when you get wealthy, don't think to yourself, I've done this, and forget the Lord. Because then when you forget the Lord, it sets up sort of this Deuteronomic cycle where you violate the covenant curses come upon you, and you crash to the bottom. Community actually helps this, because part of the reason community isn't... Everybody talks a good game about community, and in fact, this interview goes a little further.
We all know how that story unfolded. Dr. Putnam, your work is all about connection, so I'm wondering first, can you describe your own social life? I mean, what clubs are you in?
That's a really embarrassing question. I write about and talk about the importance of connections, of social capital, which is my jargon for connections and trust and so on. But my wife actually does it. She is actually the one who joins everything, who has been a tutor and a teacher and a terrific mother and an even better grandmother. We've got 2 kids and 7 grandchildren. And in the long run, her work is going to have a longer half-life than mine. I'm not just being modest, because those kids are going to be around long after people have forgotten anything about this Putnam, the writer and author.
So that's a long...
And he's exactly right. And it stands in such stark contradiction to the way that she opened the interview. Now, I think part of the reason, and I hold to the fact that we sort of naturally pull in and hold in. But then when there are things out there that we want, well, then we have to want them. And then we have this internal fight between them. But then you set up this dynamic where we start getting our eyes off ourselves and being self-conscious, and we start being conscious of another. And of course, falling in love is all of that. Falling in love, you just project like mad at the object of your fascination and infatuation and devotion. And of course, part of what happens with, let's say, the 7-year itch is that over a period of time, you start to project less and less, and actually who that other person is comes in more and more. And then you're going to have to do the real work of actually negotiating and building love instead of just being in this point of infatuation. But real community actually has a ton of natural recalibrations in this, because real community is hard. Because people are hard. People disappoint. People make mistakes. People are selfish. So one selfish person, another selfish person. And the only way the relationship is actually going to work is if the people can get a lot less selfish and begin to get into a very virtuous cycle where there is, in fact, giving and receiving in the context of relationship. And so much of the childhood development that we go through is to try to train our children to do this. Unfortunately, these screens push us in the other direction, because the screens ask nothing of us and we get what we want from them. And so then we get into this cycle where it's just pull, 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 pull. Now, I just noticed that Andrew Huberman is in a new podcast. It's so funny because a lot of people knew who this guy was before I did. And actually, when he had his conversation with Jordan Peterson, Michaela kept sort of working on the thumbnail and working on the title, and I made a snarky comment on Twitter, which she didn't appreciate about it. But what is interesting is that, well, he's a very big deal. And of course, talked about him in the Ross Douthat, Louise Perry video. And, I don't know. I haven't listened to the whole 4 hours of this interview. But a couple little points right at the beginning.
I'll tear up if I talk about it, because things were going well in my life, and then one day just crack, everything came crashing down.
Did that coincide with a New Yorker article about you? Maybe, I don't know.
And I've learned that friendship is super powerful. I had people descending on my home to be with me. One day I just look up and Lex is in the room. And they sat with me, picked me up, and they reminded me who I am. And, I've just such immense gratitude for that.
So that's the sort of the, I don't know. That's sort of that's when we think about what we need from community, the power of community, the positivity of community. It's all there. But that's just such a tiny sliver of it. Now, it's powerful and it's meaningful and it's important and it's absolutely it's a wonderful life moment where George Bailey is in trouble and the whole world, everyone moves heaven and earth to bail out George Bailey because, well, George Bailey's a great guy. But the truth is, George Baileys are pretty unusual. And a lot of other schmucks are kind of much there in the middle. But now, so that's sort of the teaser in this thing. And let's see. Does they go into dopamine next? Oh, yeah, they do dopamine next. I just saw the very beginning of it.
Dr. Andrew Huberman is a world-renowned neuroscientist, Stanford professor, and podcaster.
Revolutionizing how we understand the brain
and how we can adopt change, break bad habits, and achieve peak performance.
Growing up, I was scared, depressed, and confused. My parents split up. I was getting in multiple fights. I found myself locked up in this residential treatment program. And I realized that I need to take control of my life.
I'm so intrigued by that because so many people feel stuck in their lives. So how does someone even make those life-changing decisions?
And of course, the focus is on technical. How does someone make? And it's like, again, as a pastor, people always sort of want the techne of how to make changes in their life. And for the most part, it's not the techne, it's the actually making the change. And you can tell people to do it, and you can scare people into doing it. But whether they're actually going to make any change, that's a whole nother thing.
Well, there are so many zero-cost tools that can change your brain. We can go through all of them. So
I want to talk about dopamine in this graph.
The dopamine is kind of like a wave pool in every domain of life, whether or not it's food, exercise. For some people, it's work or sex. If you push things to the max, you're going to feel depleted and understimulated afterwards, and you need so much more energy to get the same output. And when you're in...
Okay, now take that and add it to the Tocqueville paradox. And you begin to realize that, we really do need each other. We really do need each other. Because if you're isolated, alone, and then the question is, well, how do I actually build community? Because part of the difficulty of this is that people in churches often have the same dumb ideas. And one of the dumb ideas that people have in church is, well, you take all these lonely people and you put them together and they're not lonely anymore. And what people don't realize is that, because I've watched churches try this all the time and it never works, because not everybody has the same capacity for community. And, if we sort of leave people to their devices and their screens, then you've got these dopamine crashes and you've got these de Tocqueville paradoxes, and you can very easily see that on a scale in a society like ours, that's going to get out of whack really quick. Well, what do you have to do to get around it? Well, people are going to need to have deep, meaningful, regular, face-to-face relationships with one another. And they're in many ways going to have to be involuntary. Why? Because if we have the option of not doing it, many of us won't do it because it's hard. So you're going to need those kinds of relationships. And there's going to have to be cost for not following through in them. Now, to a degree, you had them as a child, perhaps if you were living in a household and your mom made you sit and have dinner together. Perhaps you had it with school, and well, who knows how school would go. But again, if you put a whole group of people together, what you begin to realize is that people who have the relational capital, the capacity to actually build relationships with other people, it's sort of like nursing. There's this great story that I've told already of these were, when I went to the mission field, these were my supervisors, these were my mentors. It was a missionary couple, career missionaries towards the end of their career. My wife and I get there, beginning missionaries at the beginning of our career, also just had our first child. And even though both my wife and I babysit as kids and thought we knew a lot about babies, once you have that baby and you have full responsibility for that baby, it's like, oh, there's whole bunches of things we don't know, just like the whole religion thing, because you don't know what you don't know. And so there were a bunch of other younger missionary families around us. They could give us little pointers. But then the woman who lived downstairs from us, who was the wife of my mentor and my boss on the mission field, I was on internship, told us a story. She said, I went to Argentina as a young mother, first-time missionary, had our first child in Argentina. So again, my mother, my parents, everything was all back home. I didn't have anyone to sort of mother me. And at that point, unlike the United States, when like many people my age were put on a bottle right away, everyone would nurse. And nursing is a very difficult thing. You're not brought into this world knowing how to nurse, either as a baby or as a mother. And so mothers have to learn how to nurse and babies have to learn how to nurse. And so a first-time baby, first-time mom, it's kind of a problem. Well, in this hospital in Argentina where she gave birth, the nurses were pretty smart. Down the hall was a woman. She had had like her third or fourth child. And that mother who knew how to nurse taught the baby how to nurse. And that baby was just doing great. So this would never happen in an American hospital. The hospital staff takes the baby who already knows how to nurse, gives it to the mother of her first child, and the baby taught the mother how to nurse, and the baby who didn't know how to nurse was given to the woman who had had multiple children, and that woman taught that baby how to nurse. So for a couple of days or a day or something, both the baby and the first-time mom figured out nursing. So then after a little while, they just swapped the babies back and everything was fine. And then this woman who I knew, she went on to have 3 more kids, and nursing was always fine. So it's kind of like that with people in relationships. You need to have people who know how to have relationships for other people to sort of learn to have relationships. And when you get sort of a group of people, if you have all the people who don't know how to have relationships, or they have other challenges in their lives that are impeding their relational capacity, and you put them together, they all get more lonely because they don't know how to do it. So what you actually need are a mixture, and you need some generous people and people who know how to handle relationships, people who can manage bumps and difficulties that always come into relationships, and then off they go. And actually these relationships sort of moderate the Tocqueville paradox, because relationships are so hard, very seldom do you get sort of these dopamine hits that we're all sort of looking for. Most of the time we just get a little bit of juice and we have a normal good experience, and then sometimes we'll have a bad experience. But because the relationships are involuntary, you're going to have to go back and try again and figure out how to mend and go on and on and on and on. And as I look at society right now, this lack of relational capacity, I think, is probably one of the biggest crises we have. Because the only way people can actually do the amazing things that people can do is if people have relational capacity. And so much of this relational capacity, learning to forgive one another, learning to turn the other cheek, learning to communicate well, learning to hold people accountable sometimes when they need to be held accountable. All of these kinds of things are really the fabric that make communities work. And if you don't have communities, you're going to lose everything. So, yeah, it's kind of scary out there. And again, the real answer to this is involuntary communities. But, Jordan Peterson also makes a really strong point about, well, actually, they also sort of have to be voluntary. So, again, even in that, they need to be voluntary enough so that you get the rewards of mastery of it. But they need to be involuntary enough that you can't just shrug off and not be there. That's, in church work, it's always about giving someone a job. Because someone will come to church and say, oh, I like church. I need church. Church is great. The sermon was great. The people were wonderful. This was great. So they come 2-3 times, or maybe only once. And the next Sunday morning comes around, it's like, am I going to get up and go to church? Or am I going to roll over and watch some YouTube? YouTube usually wins. So that's why you give people a job, because then it's like, oh, I don't feel like going to church, but I have this job at church. And if I don't go to church, then they're all going to be they're not going to be able to handle that thing. And I'm going to lose status in their eyes, and people are really motivated by status. And so, all right, I'll go to church. And I have that in a number of areas of my life. And it's often the case that, oh, I got to go do this because I have this job to do, and blah, 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 blah. After I do it, I'm happy I did it. So, boy, I'm sure glad I did that. I wouldn't have done it if it was completely voluntary. So I needed a little bit of stickiness to it. So I am out of time. Someone's coming to see me. But, yeah, I don't know what I'll title this thing, but it's what I think. Leave a comment.